It's that time of year again. It's Halloween. So to get in the spirit of things, I'm going to do a little narration for you guys. Remember to have a good night. Try not to go anywhere you're not supposed to, at least for too long. And don't eat any candy from some guy who's waving it in front of you, and he has a big white fan. Just don't do that shit. So this story is going to be The Devil's Cabin by EldraziHorror. I think it's Cabin. Yeah, The Devil's Cabin by EldraziHorror. Enjoy. My friend Adam and I rented a cabin in early July at Letchworth State Park in western New York. We wanted to see its massive gorges and picturesque waterfalls for ourselves. After hearing so much about this so-called Grand Canyon of the East. During our visit, we drove through and hiked much of the 17-mile-long park, and it certainly lived up to its hype. However, we only ended up staying one night at our cabin. The D cabins are a small grouping of one-room lodges in the southern east quarter of the park. They are in a remote area of Letchworth, in that most tourists and hikers congregate on the western side of the Genesee River Gorge. Adam and I were practically alone in the congregation of 8 or so cabins when we arrived. A man and a woman from a neighboring cabin were packing up to leave as we were unpacking our car, and they kindly handed us a watermelon before they left. They seemed to be in a hurry, so we didn't chat with them for very long. Once they were gone, there were only 2 other occupied cabins. But they were distant enough from us that we never really saw much of those people during our night's stay. We didn't hang around the cabin long once the car was unloaded. We were on our way to a trailhead, and when we spotted a Civil War parade field with a cannon and memorial. It was strange seeing an empty field and barren picnicking area in a popular state park in July. So I commented that the field must be haunted by Civil War ghosts. Adam suggested that we should revisit it some night and see for ourselves. The hike itself was fun. We found our way down to the river canyon and eventually crossed over to the western side and saw one of the waterfalls. When we returned to our cabin that evening, it was already twilight. We played a few board games, ate sandwiches, then put down our folding cots. The cabin was basically the size of a kitchen. It had a small stove and refrigerator, a tiny table with 2 chairs, and 2 rolling cots. Once they were down, it was difficult to move anywhere. Scratched into the log walls were countless names and dates of past occupants. Friends, lovers, and vandals all made their presence known. Some from as far back as the 1970s. We weren't the sort of people to carve our names into a cabin. Look at that. A pentagram, said Adam. I went over and inspected the star. There were some symbols I didn't recognize around it. It stood out because every other carving seemed to either be an expression of love or just a record of someone's presence. Great. We're staying in the Devil's Cabin, I said, grinning. Adam shrugged it off and we moved on. We eventually sat down for a round of cards and had a few drinks. Hey, how about we cut that watermelon open? Said Adam. With what? I asked. There was not cutlery of any kind in the cabin. Good question, said Adam. I think I have my pocket knife in my bag. He retrieved a Swiss Army-style knife, and it took about 15 minutes with the small blade struggling to cut through the rind, but eventually we were able to pry the melon into halves. Nasty, said Adam as we revealed the black, gooey rot which had consumed the melon. The molded innards began to run onto the floor from my half. It seemed to have liquefied as soon as it was exposed to the air. Quick, toss it! We both heaved our portions of the stinking, sopping mess out the cabin door. It was a unique rot, a sweet, fetid decomposition. Adam and I cleaned up the floor and laughed at the gift our neighbors had left us. We then returned to our game, but soon enough we were nodding off, and eventually agreed that it was time for bed. It was still relatively early, but it was dark, and we were beat from a full day of hiking. I fell asleep immediately and slept for hours. before I was rudely awakened by a knock at the cabin door. Honestly, it was more of a rumbling, like someone was shaking the door as opposing to knocking it. Darkness had enveloped the cabin, inside and out, and I couldn't hear much of anything with the small fan that was blowing in the window, only a yard or so from my head. I got up, looked at Adam, who was still sleeping, then checked my phone for the time. It was 2:30 a.m. It was an eerie feeling, the uncertainty of who was at the door at the hour. I was tense, though not yet scared, as I had been camping a time or two when a ranger or park attendant had interrupted my night's sleep for various reasons. Sometimes it was because someone was missing in the area, and sometimes it was for maddening reasons. Like 2 tents were too close to each other, even though we had rented 2 adjoining campsites so we could camp together. I flipped the outside light on and unlocked the door, then slowly cracked it open to look out. I was in my boxers and a t-shirt, so I immediately felt self-conscious when I saw that it was an old woman out there. "Can I help you?" I asked. I couldn't get a good look at her face, as it was mostly obscured by the dark. She had a hunchback and her long, scraggly gray hair was tucked into a green army jacket. She then held up something, and I realized she was offering it to me. "I have an extra cantaloupe. Would you like it?" I didn't immediately reply, as I was floored by how rude she had been to wake me up so early in the morning just to offer me a cantaloupe. I assumed she was crazy and wanted to get back to bed, so I simply said that I would take her melon. I cracked the door enough to reach out and receive the fruit. "Enjoy," she said. I thanked her and closed the door. I peeked out the window to make sure she was leaving, and once she drifted off into the night, I turned off the outside light, tossed the cantaloupe onto the stove, and went back to bed. I couldn't get back to sleep as I pictured the old crone watching the cabin from somewhere close by. I thought of the unsolved Kettle murders, a family who were gruesomely murdered one night at a cabin in California. A couple of children were left unharmed in another room and had slumped through the brutal slayings. No one who was staying in any of the neighboring cabins had heard anything either. I wondered if Adam would have woken up if the old woman had stabbed me through the door, as opposed to handing me a melon. There were a few mosquitoes and moths in the cabin now, so I was also having a real and imagined encounters with them, which prolonged my sleeplessness. I couldn't quite stretch my legs, as I would touch the walls and didn't like the idea of creepy crawlies having easy access to me. But I was still tired, so eventually I drifted back off to sleep. I'm not sure how long I slept, but it wasn't yet dawn, as everything was still incredibly dark, but I was awakened again, this time more gradually, by a man's voice in the area. I couldn't understand what he was saying at first, and I figured he was some distance away, but when I got up to peek out the window, I quickly realized that someone was standing just outside the door. I couldn't quite make him out, but I could hear that he was talking really low, not quite whispering, but speaking in hushed tones. The fan made it difficult to understand what he was saying, but it felt too weird, and was too much of an unknown to just confront him. So I woke up Adam. "What?" Adam's eye went wide in the minuscule amount of light that came in from the moon, in the bathroom building which was just down the road. "It sounds like some guy outside the cabin is talking to himself." "Huh? What time is it?" He sat up, seemed to understand that I was scared, and this was some sort of situation. "After 3, maybe a little after 4, I don't know," I said. "An old lady came by about an hour ago and knocked on the door. Now this guy's out there. Turn on the light." I got up and leaned over the table and flipped on both switches. One illuminated the inside of the cabin and the other the outside. Adam got up and went to the door, cracking it. "What's going on? Why are you here so late?" Adam blocked my view outside, so I couldn't see who he was talking to. "No, we don't want that," he stated. "We want to get some rest. It's the middle of the night." I heard a response but couldn't make out what was said. Then Adam closed the door. "What did he want?" Adam flipped the outside light off. He turned to me and I noticed that his face had lost much of its color. He was looking past me when he spoke. It wasn't a man. It was an old lady. I could have sworn I'd heard a man talking out there. The old woman I'd spoken to earlier hadn't sounded like a man. Was she wearing a green jacket? Yep, I assume it's the same old bag. She gave me this cantaloupe. I didn't finish my thought, as when I turned to the stove to retrieve the melon, I found it cracked and covered in a dark mold, with tiny worms and larvae swarming over it. "It's nasty, dude," said Adam, nearly retching when he saw it. "Why would you bring that in here?" It wasn't like that when I took it. I grabbed a plastic shopping bag and packed up the disgusting cantaloupe, opening the door and tossed it outside. I locked the door and we huddled over the table. "What did she say to you?" I asked. I couldn't really hear over the fan. She said something about having lived in this cabin during the off-season. Then she tried to hand me a knife. What? I know, she wanted me to take the knife. She said I didn't have one big enough to cut my friend's melon. We stayed awake and vigilant until dawn, thankfully without any further visitations. As soon as there was enough light, we packed up the car and left the cabin village. We had no intention of staying another night at the Devil's Cabin. So, that was The Devil's Cabin by EldraziHorror. Remember, have a good night and stay safe out there during Halloween. I'll see you guys again. Bye.